This is the London Fintech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London Fintech Podcast, episode 14. I'm delighted to be joined on the show today by Nektarios Liolios, co-founder of Startupbootcamp Fintech. There isn't yet a good fintech incubator and accelerator guide. Does anybody want to write one? If it was, Nektarios would be, without a doubt, one of the names at the top. This morning in the coffee shop beforehand, I googled Fintech Accelerator London and Startupbootcamp came at the top. Some of you might realise this could be because of lots of PR and lots of SEO and all that kind of manipulation. But my experience of the last 6 months in fintech is quite the opposite, that Startupbootcamp and Nektarios actually get on with doing the real work. Prior to this incarnation, Nektarios has well over a decade's solid banking experience at Swift, where amongst other things he was responsible for their incubator. So who better to give us an overview of incubation and acceleration? Startupbootcamp is a global network of industry-focused startup accelerators. It was founded in Copenhagen in 2010 with the core idea of supporting the best entrepreneurs as they grow their startups. So it is a rara avis in terms of not coming out of the US tech scene. It is now the largest in Europe and one of the top 3 worldwide, another rare European triumph. They have helped 200 startups raise a total of over 64 million euros, creating well over 800 jobs and are now in 8 locations. Where did this whole acceleration concept come from? Well, the West Coast tech scene, the likes of the super well-known Y Combinator and Techstars, of course. Interestingly, however, in the fascinating Seed Rankings research into US accelerator performance, the participant in a median program over there would not recommend it to a friend. So clearly there is a real art to being a good accelerator. But backing up to the big picture, maybe you're unclear on the difference between an accelerator and an incubator. Broadly speaking, an accelerator runs a specific program with a start date, an end date, and a curriculum in between. You have to apply and enter a selection process to be accepted, and will probably be given some small amount of funding. Post-program, you're out of the nest and into the real world, even if you then join their alumni group. By contrast, an incubator is like a warm nest that you don't have to leave and will not run a specific program, even if it has events and such like to help you, nor in general have any comparable selection process. Both incubators and accelerators can have a different flavour depending on their funding, whether from a bank, for example Barclays Accelerator, one corporate or business district, for example the Level 39 Incubator funded by Canary Wharf, or Accenture's programme, or multiple funders as with Startupbootcamp in London. So that's the big picture. Let's dive more into the topic and learn about what life is really like both running and inside an accelerator. Let's get on with the show. Hi Nektarios, thanks for joining me today on the show.
Hello, hi Mike, thank you for having me.
So there's quite a lot in this that we've just been talking about. Zooming back a bit, what led you into finance in the first place? I mean, I guess many of us actually kind of stumbled into finance. I guess we could call that old finance now. And then how come you moved on to what we might call, for the sake of argument, new finance?
It's funny, I used to say nobody grows up thinking, I want to be a back office person at XYZ Bank. I went to university and I didn't study anything that would qualify me to work in finance or in tech. I studied political science, media sociology and Latin linguistics.
Oh, okay.
Which makes me the perfect person to work on a fintech accelerator.
Yeah.
Stumbled upon it like everybody else. I had some foreign language skills, I knew how to work computers, and I ended up working for a central securities depository called CEDAL at that time.
Oh yes, I know them well from my fund management days.
Well, they were looking for somebody to support their proprietary software, and that was my foot in the door in the mid-90s. And little by little, one thing led to another. I ended up switching from the tech side to the business side, starting understanding how securities work, how payments work. And 17 years later, we're sitting here and we're talking about it.
Okay, and going back to the Swift incarnation, they've been doing quite a lot in this space before fintech became a kind of mainstream media thing. And I mentioned the Update, and they have a nice little YouTube 5 minutes every week, which I try and watch most of the time to keep track of what's going on. But Update, I don't actually know much about. So what was all that about?
The Swift initiative. Swift is a cooperative. People don't know that. So everything
it's a bunch of hippies in some commune, and I'd never imagined them look quite like that.
It's far from it. It's a membership organization, and the members are the financial industry players. So the banks, the fund managers, the broker dealers, the custodians, the central depositories, the kind of infrastructures in the financial industry. And post-crisis in 2008, the visionary CEO at the time decided that apart from providing the technological infrastructure for payments and other transactions, Swift owes it to its members to also alert them about the changes and help them understand what they need to do to survive. And with a group of motivated people founded InnoTribe. InnoTribe had as a mission to enable collaborative innovation in the financial industry.
Right. So which year was that then?
This was in 2009.
Okay, so that's quite a while ago.
Yeah, it was, and it was an experiment. It was well funded at the time. It was all about bringing innovation to the banks, getting them to understand what are the things that are actually happening in the real world. So it was all about understanding trends, understanding technological developments, and finding the right method of actually making the people on the financial industry side understand it, embrace it, examine it, experiment with it. At the same time, we also at that point talked to the banks about internal innovation, culture change and mind change. How do you enable your population within the bank to actually be more creative, finding avenues how you can channel these ideas and bridging between the two worlds. And this is something that banks are still struggling with today, finding the right way of, okay, startup engagement to the outside world.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realise the deep roots of your background, because in terms of, say, wandering around the scene, it had always struck me, and this isn't flattery, people who listen to the show sometimes think I'm very flattering to people, but actually it's much more a question of a filter in the first place. I filter out 9 out of 10 and interview the 1 out of 10 who I think really have something interesting to say. And therefore it's a true statement that, when I've been here before and seen your work and the companies that are passing through it, I always had something that I couldn't quite connect about how kind of deep it was in a world where a lot of stuff is too PR-y. You're coming from the solid thing, and obviously these are roots going back, and you've been yourself thinking about it for a number of years. I mean, didn't you join here just like January this year?
We started Startupbootcamp in January, but ultimately everything we do here is informed by working in the financial industry innovation space for the last 5 years.
Yes.
Working in the sense of trying to know about the things that are happening. So we talked and thought about cloud and big data 5 years ago, about digital assets 4 years ago, and all these things were subjects that we actually discussed with the community. But the last 3 years of my life at InnoTribe, I was managing something called the InnoTribe Startup Challenge. So this was our way of engaging, reaching out to startups and bringing them in front of the financial industry and saying to the banks and the other FIs, look, these are the people that you need to work with. We're helping you build the bridge, right?
Yeah.
And we saw the poster boys of Fintech have been part of the Startup Challenge. TransferWise were in the competition. Azima were in the competition. The Currency Cloud was in the competition. So a lot of the names that we now take for granted, we have come across.
The secret history of Fintech is all in your head.
And it's also part of this was also the idea of being involved in an accelerator comes from that, comes from this kind of experience and knowledge, knowing that actually I've come across some really interesting startups. Maybe there's a way of getting deeper involved with the startups, and this is why we've started doing Startupbootcamp Fintech in London at the beginning of this year.
That's very interesting, and also with a deep background like that, you know the realpolitik about how life really works compared to what happens in blogs. And it's these friction points in terms of how life really works, whether they're, difficult individuals or difficult processes in organisation. In a way, oiling those components of the engine is half the way to get a result. If you come to any industry, I always use biotech as an example. If I go into biotech tomorrow, there's some stuff that I can learn, but there's some stuff that I will learn by having been there 5 years about what really people worry about or how they act and all this kind of stuff. So coming on from your personal background, coming up to the big picture, a lot of vocabulary can end up doing two things. It can divide the insiders from the outsiders, which is a wall I want to break down. And secondly, it can end up, even within the insiders, obscuring understanding, because people cling to terms and people discuss it as though they're talking about the same term, but they've got a different idea of an incubator or an accelerator in their head. And I mentioned in the introduction that an incubator is like a nest. At a minimum, it's a co-working space where you hang out with other people doing the similar thing, and there's great value in that. At best, they're putting on events and got mentors and that kind of thing. And then, as I say, an accelerator is a specific program with a start date and an end date. But anyway, you tell me, as somebody from the inside and running one of these things, how you view this whole process. If I'm somebody out there and I know nothing at all about it, and I might say a new fintech, what would I need to know to understand?
It's interesting when you work in the financial industry and people ask you what you do. Usually it's really difficult to explain to people what you do. So I thought about this and I realized that telling people about an accelerator doesn't really help. So I started saying I work with startups. So I was talking to my barber the other day and he said to me, well, what do you do? And he thought I said I work for Starbucks, which was kind of funny.
Right, okay. Starbucks makes more money, doesn't it?
That's a very different discussion. The main goal of any program, be it an incubator or accelerator, is to provide a vehicle and a tool for the startup to be more successful. Right? The word in itself, accelerator, means you condense that period. Right? So what we do with startups is when we have them in the program, we sit them down at the beginning And we ask them, what is your roadmap for the next 12 to 18 months? They tell us, and then we say, okay, let's try and do this in 3, hence the accelerator.
And hence the bootcamp bit. And it ain't easy.
It ain't easy. It is a pressure cooker. Coming back to your question, ultimately, if I were a startup and I would try to succeed in the financial industry, I recognize really quickly that it's not as easy as putting on a sexy consumer app on the App Store and somebody will download it in the millions within the next few weeks. So it takes a long time. So you need to find people who will help you along the way. And this is how we know that startups become aware of us. They are looking for somebody who brings in the right level of expertise and the right contacts to make it possible to actually get into this world, because it's quite an exclusive world, right?
Yeah, going back to the process, so if you're a startup fintech and you haven't heard of these things, then the obvious top 3 in terms of quality are you guys, Accenture's program and Barclays Accelerator. And people can look at all 3 of those and then they apply and they go through some selection process and they join. In terms of the cohort that you ran this year, with the benefit of hindsight, what are the most valuable value adds that an accelerator in general, not just yours, will give to a startup in practice? Because in theory we can think, oh, they need more advice on how to present or pitch or blah, 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 blah.
First of all, can I say a couple more words about the selection process? Because we don't just wait for the startups to come to us, because we know that a lot of startups don't even know about these things. So part of our model is that we go into every location where we know that there's entrepreneurial activity and the financial industry presence, and we get the startups to apply to us locally. So we're there for a day, we interact with the teams, we put in
it's like a milk round.
Yeah, it's a funny way of putting it. The interesting thing is that makes the communities more aware of these programs, and that makes us attract startups that wouldn't necessarily consider coming to a program like ours. But we also hunt the startups, we actually headhunt them, because we know that there's amazing teams out there and we need to articulate the value that we can bring. Now, coming back to the question, so the key things that a startup wants when they come to us is that at the end of the program they find funding and they find business. And this is really it, right? So in order to achieve this, we need to achieve a few things. We need to make the business a solid business. We need to evaluate the business model. We need to look at the proposition. We need to make sure that there's no risk elements. We need to look at the competitive landscape. We need to help them articulate the business. We need to help them validate the assumptions on which the business is built on, and a variety of different things in that.
So if I just press pause at that point, would it be true to say then that you're like a mini MBA but at a practical level? If you're going to do an MBA, you do theory, you do books, you write essays. If you do this, it's a bit like going through that, but with your business.
There is definitely an MBA element to this, and there's a few people that actually described it as such.
Right, crossed with the Royal Marines or something.
The first week is hardcore, because if you imagine you're a startup, you've been working on this for a year, maybe 2 years. You might even have already customers and you generate revenue, and then you come into the program and somebody sits you down, and at the end of this day, they've identified all the holes in your model and tell you, before you actually continue, you need to go back with your existing customers and the people spoken to and just validate all the things you think you built for them without necessarily knowing that they actually need them. It's one thing, right? So yeah, it's absolutely an MBA. It is an MBA that gets really hands-on really quickly, but it also uses a lot of people in a wider network, which we call mentors, right? Who help you do that. And this is something that you wouldn't get in an MBA. So these are people from the industry. These are people who understand the business you're in, but these are also potential customers. These are people who understand entrepreneurship, people who've done this before, and they can help you work through the difficult questions that you have as a CEO, as a CTO, as somebody who's going through a really difficult period in your life at the moment.
Yeah. So going through the process, you've got the selection stage where you say you're proactive. The people then come on this mini MBA times bootcamp times Royal Marines. They get the value add from you guys. They get the value add from the mentors. I like your use of the word solid, because thinking about 2015 in London fintech going forwards, it strikes me that the old FS, to use a cliche, needs to become sexier, but a lot of the new FS needs to become more solid. There's a reason historically that all the banking architecture around the Bank of England and all that is solid, because what do you want when you're giving your money to somebody? Literally, you want solid, reliable, trustworthy, dependable. And as you say, on consumer stuff, you can stick some app out there, or you can do A/B testing or whatever. And do you know what? Oh, the website was down for a day. Oh, well, never mind. It's back up and you can all chat to your mates again. But it's very different if, oh, I couldn't get my money yesterday. That could just screw your business forever. So how do you do solid, to ask a silly question? Or a good question, I don't know. Maybe it's both.
Solid means that, first of all, it needs to be a business that covers all aspects, that it is something that looks to be profitable to start with, right? Let's rephrase this. Let's start somewhere else, right? Every startup we look at needs to be solving a problem. Very often we see people who build a startup, build a company, and very often it's a solution looking for a problem. So for me, part of Solid is, you know that there's a problem.
You might say Bitcoin is, but that's another story.
That's a very different conversation. Yeah, the first few weeks of the program is really making it the perfect product market fit, right? Making it very clear what is the problem that you're solving, how you're solving it, articulating this very, very clearly, making sure it's tight. That's one thing, right? And then looking at the business model. We had a startup in this cohort that came in with what they thought is the perfect B2B proposition. And after this first month of prodding and probing, they realized that the only way this can work is actually if they go B2C.
Right.
So that's what I mean with a solid business.
So you need the foundations of the business idea before you get the solid engineering on top.
Yeah. It's when I talk about solid, it's not so much the engineering, because the technology is usually not the problem.
Yes, these days it's much easier than 10 years ago to produce good technology.
Yeah.
I say easier, it's not easy.
But still, yeah, and then it's really all about finding the right way of approaching this, finding the right model that provides a solution, but also is attractive to the banks, because most of the startups that we see, they want to work with the banks, they want to sell into the banks, they want to become partners.
Yes, this is one of the problems that I've been reflecting on, going back to the problems of vocabulary. We've all got stuck with this Fintech word, medtech, edtech, Fintech. But there really are two very different sets. There are kind of new financial services firms, for example, peer-to-peer lending or crowdfunders. And there are new tech firms selling to financial services. And there's nothing wrong with A or there's nothing wrong with B, but they're very different animals.
Capital F or capital T?
Yeah, so fintech or fintech, I guess. So in terms of, let's go back to Startupbootcamp, in terms of your cohorts, is it about a dozen or something in the cohort?
10.
Are there 10 fintechs or fintechs?
It's a broad spectrum. Our ambition has always been to be very broad in the definition within the financial services range, so from retail to corporate banking to investment banking, wealth, etc., but also to look at pure technology. This year, we've seen that the cohort has not been too tech heavy. There's been a couple of teams that were really big on the tech. Most of it was taking an offline business and taking it into the cloud or a business model. So some of it are quite technologically heavy. So one of the teams that does credit scoring using social data, this is very much driven by technology. Another team that we have that does micropayments for content, that's heavy on the technology. But some of the other businesses are more new financial services.
Right. So I guess that leads on quite nicely, coincidentally in a way, into the question of the funding in the various accelerators. So as I say, you've got the obvious example of Barclays Accelerator, which is a corporate accelerator, i.e. one corporate backs it, and you've got priority inroads into that corporate. And I think TechCrunch some time ago wrote a very interesting article, I'll put it in the show notes, called Are Corporate Accelerators an Oxymoron? We're not here today to talk about whether corporate accelerators is an oxymoron or not, but suffice it to say, there are, like all models, there are some pros and there are some cons. And one of the subtle cons that I wasn't really aware of until I read it in the article was that if you get spat out of a corporate accelerator, I'm not talking about Barclays, I'm talking about all the ones that do exist in the world and in other sectors, not just fintech. It's really because somehow what you've got doesn't suit that firm, but you can come out with a bit of a bad smell, which is, oh, you're in this program and they didn't even touch your stuff. Well, it can't be that good if they didn't, So there's accelerators like that. At the opposite end of the spectrum, Startupbootcamp is notable for having a broad range of investors, funders, whatever you call them. So how does that work? And in particular, I can just imagine if I was a corporate and you came along and you asked me for some funding, I'd probably want to differentiate between funding you for helping businesses that are going to help me and funding you to help businesses that are going to try and destroy me, put in a very caricature terms.
First of all, I think that all programs add something. And this is not just empty words. It really is that everybody contributes something to the ecosystem. There's still so much need for support for the startups. But ultimately, the motivations of everybody doing Accelerator are different, right? The situation you just described is a conversation we have every time we launch a program. It is having to articulate to a corporate, in this case, a financial services company, a bank or a card scheme, that there's a line between collaborative innovation and the competitive space. And those who are part of our program understand that. They understand that in certain areas, it's not about looking to be that one step ahead in front of your competition, but just being part of an innovation initiative that helps the industry.
So just to try and make sure I understand that, and for the audience, so for example, and please agree or disagree, so for example, even if I'm a corporate or I'm a bank and I'm funding some program and or co-funding a program, and this program is incubating, accelerating a bunch of startups who are potentially going to be new competitors for me, there would be a spin-off for me in terms of being more exposed to innovation and firms happening. Is that what you mean, or something different?
When we start a program, we sit our partners around the table and everybody talks openly about what they want to get out of it. Right. The biggest argument is people just want to see what's coming through, what's happening. It's having a finger on the pulse, understanding what's coming through. If there is a startup that I as a bank want to engage with, I can do this in a filtered way. And with our partners, they don't mind that, okay, this startup will work with me, but they might also work with Bank B or Bank C who are sitting next to me. So in our case, it's Lloyds, it's Rabobank, it's Intesa Sanpaolo, and it's MasterCard on the financial services side, right? We also have Avata Financial, which is a German services company. They all work together, they talk to each other, and some of the startups work with 3, 4, 5 of the partners, and that's absolutely fine. The whole kind of, how do I deal with a startup that wants to put me out of business? Interestingly enough, how many startups are really actively looking to put a bank out of business?
You read my mind, or I read yours, because I was actually just thinking when you were talking that, again, it's one of the media narratives that's a little bit of a myth, which is that fintech's out there destroying the banks. Well, as you say, very few. Very few you can imagine that in 5 or 10 years are real competitors to Barclays or Citigroup and have got Citigroup quaking in their boots. I mean, a number of them, you mentioned TransferWise, will take away a chunk of a segment of their business. But HSBCs and Citigroups are so vast worldwide, they end up sacking a few thousand people. I don't mean to sound cynical, but they sack 10,000 a year anyway.
It's not even the most attractive business to a bank that most of the startups are actually going for, right? Yeah. So doing peer-to-peer Forex and taking away the retail Forex side of things from a bank, I think it's great if you can do this in a way that the consumer benefits from. I don't think there's a lot of banks sitting there quivering. I think what banks are getting really nervous is they don't really know how to embrace new technology and use it to their own benefit. And they don't really know how to partner with a startup that can provide this technology, because in their heads they still think they have to build it themselves. So this is where the line between collaborative and competitive comes in again. I think that financial institutions overall are trying to make sense of this new world, are trying to find ways of engaging with these new companies. But in some cases, their procurement teams wouldn't allow them to do this because they have such ancient requirements to even collaborate with or work with a vendor of sorts, if that vendor is a 5-man shop with an 18-month history.
Absolutely. I had this experience myself in 1998 when I set up a fintech well ahead of the right time for doing it, or the easy time for doing it. And it was tricky for the organisations to get around their head about basically a 1.5-man band providing them some software which would be mission critical. And that was an issue to address. And, you know, in terms of what you're doing and what your friend Samad is doing at Accenture, a large part of the value add is that you guys have got an understanding, good relationships over a beer with these people, and can just smooth the interface between the two, because it can be like, on the one hand, a circle and a square, and if you're left to yourself, you're trying to fit your circle into the square and you have a hard time.
The banks we work with are quite visionary in that sense. They understand the necessity and the relevance of
presumably
engagement.
Part of the banks are visionary. I find it hard imagining an entire bank that's visionary.
Of course, we always go for the teams that get it.
Yeah.
But if you have an organization that's had an innovation division for 10 years or has now built a digital bank with that view in mind that this is going to be our way of dealing with the new stuff, that's great. And that's great because it helps the startups, but it also helps the banks to survive. Let's not forget that, right?
Absolutely. So I think that's really very clear about the number of elements going around. I mean, time is moving on. I'd like to talk a little bit more about Startup Bootcamp and your global expansion. We'll come back to London in a second, but you've just come back on a plane from Singapore, where it's rather warmer than it is in London. Every time I come around here, it seems to rain torrentially for some reason. So tell me about Singapore. What's going on over there?
We launched Startupbootcamp Fintech Singapore a couple of days ago.
So what does that mean? You've now got an office? You've got one person, 10 people?
That means we're building the program in the same way that we have it here.
When's the first program going to launch?
Applications are open since last Friday. The cohort comes in at the beginning of May, and it's a 13-week program just like in London. So it will be running 6 months after the London program.
And what's the scene like in Singapore?
Singapore is a very exciting ecosystem.
Yeah.
Singapore has all the components that we need. It has an educated investor community. It has a broad range of financial services, individuals that we can tap into as mentors. It has strong government support to encourage and enable entrepreneurship. And it is the hub for startups in Southeast Asia. So we know that startups all the way from India through to Australia and to Japan are looking at Singapore as one of the areas where they go if they want to do business.
Right. And Singapore has always lived by its wits, being a small little island on the edge of a big peninsula. So they've always been very aware and very ahead of the curve in terms of, we need to do differently next year what we do this year, otherwise we'll somehow fall behind.
And for us, when we started Startupbootcamp Fintech in London, we knew that the only way this is going to add real value is for it to become a global network of fintech-focused accelerator programs.
Right.
So we went to Asia first. We're looking at the US. We're looking at other locations around the world.
It's an interesting example of Europe invading the US, something it hasn't done for centuries.
Yeah, well, there's actually, if you look at the US market, there's not a lot of fintech-focused presence, especially using our model.
There's the Accenture program.
There's the Accenture program, which is where it started, right? Yeah. There's a couple of other fintech accelerators, but they're all slightly different. And we really believe that the model we use is the one that helps startups most, but it's also one that the industry gets most out of it. So I think over the next 18 months, there's going to be a lot more to watch in that sense.
Interesting. So fairly soon, the sun will never set on the Startup Bootcamp fintech empire, and you'll be sitting here at the control panel, turning big dials and knobs, will you?
Stroking a cat, yes.
Exactly, a nice white cat. You mentioned the different accelerators, and I don't want to get into, we're best, they're worst kind of conversation, but again, my feeling of how this industry is going to mature is there's going to be more focus and more niche rather than general. Everyone you're just mentioning the firms that come through your accelerator. You can almost have a meta program for accelerators. And if you're imagining doing that and you take all the accelerators through, all the incubators through, you grill them and say, okay, so what specifically, Nektarios, what specifically are you guys really good at? And you refine it down to the proposition, and then that enables them to grow faster. Do you think there's going to be this kind of niche or speciation or increasing focus or differentiations going forward?
I think what is happening now, and if you look at the press, there's every other day there's another accelerator, incubator or escalator or other programs that are being set up. People are recognizing that this is a tool that is going to be around for a while, that companies grow in a different way than they did 10, 15 years ago. I think the real value to the startups comes with specialist knowledge and focus. So we already see that there's more specialist programs, accelerators starting up. There was an announcement today about a financial inclusion focused program. There will be at some point a Bitcoin focused program or crypto focused.
I think I saw one a while ago.
So there is definitely the need for specialization, but at the same time, we also need to look at startups' stages. You just very flippantly mentioned this, but I think there's definitely a need to provide something to the startups that have been through a program like ours, are now at the beginning of the growth curve, and they're looking for somebody to support them there, so they get the real hockey stick. So we're working on something. We know that a few people are trying to find the right model that will actually provide these more mature startups an avenue.
Yeah, so the follow-up spaces, I quite like the WeWork space. It's a rather bizarre one in that they've got beer on tap, which sounds very attractive until you spend your first week there, and then by Tuesday afternoon you're getting no work done. Maybe it's a little bit gimmicky, but one or two of the companies I've spoken to at WeWork have been through kind of something, and then it's going into a kind of friendly environment to base themselves on. So there are interesting opportunities out there. I don't know how your alumni program works, for example, but if you just look at it from a fitness metaphor, you go on this intensive program and you get intensively fit and you lose a stone or you lose 10 kilograms over 3 months. You're bulging with your muscles and you've been drinking your green smoothies and keeping off them Big Macs and that kind of stuff. And then get your hand shaken, you get your certificate, Startup Bootcamp approved, and then you get told to go to the gym as often as possible and keep off the too many beers. And after a while, you kind of have a little flag. It's a bit like, I can imagine it's a bit like taking off an aircraft carrier. You rush down there, you're off into the air, and then a bit like all planes off aircraft carriers, they slightly dip after they've gone off the carrier. Or am I talking complete rubbish with you?
No. No, I just stayed with your gym metaphor because I put on weight during the program.
Well, it's all these trips to Singapore with the lovely food, you see.
It's a very valid point. And there is not a lot out there. There's very little out there. Our alumni program, we only had a structured program for the last 18 months, and we're trying to shape it, to fine-tune it to actually be more valuable to the startups. Again, put yourself into the position of a startup. You've been through this program, as you described. You now have all the right things in place to be successful, but you still need support, and support means you probably still need some access to funding, and you still need open doors for business. So I think this is where the value comes in. And our intention to build something after the accelerator is exactly that, targeted just with introductions to customers and to the right funding partners for the startups' funding needs.
And one of the things we didn't touch on before, maybe we should have mentioned it or I should have brought it up, which is that, again, accelerators generically, many/most will actually take a stake in these firms. Yeah. Do you guys take a stake in the firms?
We take 8%, out of which we keep 1%, and the rest goes to our funding partners, which are the banks and the VCs that are funding this. And we give the startups the 3-month program. We give them some additional services with free credits for cloud storage and other tech benefits, which are valued at about €500,000. And on top of that, we give them €15,000, 1.5, in pocket money. That's really just to cover beer and pizza during the program.
So you guys do, in terms of alignment of interests, when someone has left your gym program, you do still have an interest in them, because if they turn into this stuff beloved of US media narratives, $1 billion IPO, you end up with a few quid in your pockets, don't you?
We're shareholders.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's important because we need also to sometimes remind the startups in a program that anything we say to them is because we want them to succeed.
Yeah.
Because imagine again, if you're an entrepreneur, you build something, somebody tells you actually what you're doing is not the right way. You're probably a little bit reluctant because to be an entrepreneur, you need an element of ego, you need to believe in the cause, right? But if somebody says to you, I'm talking to you as your shareholder because I really want this to work, it's a very different proposition.
That's interesting. You just put your finger on one of the things that I hadn't been realising over the summer. I had lots and lots of coffees with lots and lots of people. And a number of them, should we be polite, haven't got the perfect business model yet, and I end up giving them some free mentoring and all that kind of stuff. And quite often the response is, yeah, well, maybe. But they carry on regardless, you know. And I've just spent half an hour trying to tell them there's a big hole below the water, and if I was them, I'd do it. So that can be very fruitless type of mentoring, where you're giving people advice. It's like when you're advising your buddy who's always got relationship problems, and he never listens to you. After a while, it's just so tiring. You think, look, next time around, I won't bother. But where there is the shareholding, it does change the dynamic. So, wrapping up Nektarios, it's now December, and as you say, you started this incarnation early this year. You've now opened in Singapore. There's been a lot of practical experience. You mentioned that it's very hard work for the companies that come through, but I know that you're being modest because also it's very hard work for you. And if you're in need of the gym, it's because you've had too many late nights where you eat a pizza late at night here. As you explained very clearly at the beginning, you've got deep roots in this whole kind of sector well before all the media spin and hype and PR came in. Against that background, what things have been kind of a surprise to you in 2014? What have you found by doing it that was even more this than you had anticipated?
There's probably a couple of things. One of them is that I assumed accelerators attract very early stage startups. And we've seen that in our process, we managed to attract quite mature startups who were looking at this as an opportunity to grow faster and in a market that they wouldn't necessarily have tackled by themselves. So across the 10 teams that we took in, there was already more than $7 million of investment, right? So that was a surprise to me.
So that's not very, very early stages.
No, not at all, not at all. And 7 of the teams already revenue generate. The other thing that I found surprising was how involved our partners got. Because you talk to them, you know their motivations, you know that they have the possibility to experiment, to test, to pilot with a startup. But at the end of the program, 3 weeks ago, we had 21 different projects going on between the 10 startups and our partners.
That's fascinating, yeah.
And the most striking of those is one of the teams being in the conversations about becoming part of the bank's offering. So going through the procurement process that usually takes 12 to 18 months to become an accredited vendor in 3 months, that's something that I really wasn't expecting. So that's, for me, that's really one of the biggest things. And when we started at the beginning of the year, people would always ask, so what is success for you, right? And as an accelerator, you can throw numbers, right? You can say, okay, 200 startups, average funding ticket, $500,000.
800 new jobs.
Yeah, we had 75% of all the startups got funded in Startupbootcamp. So these are interesting numbers, right?
And they're very good as well. It's a good achievement. Don't be too modest.
But very, very tangibly for me, actually seeing, and then bringing in the bank survival perspective, right? Seeing banks who actually have found a way of bypassing the old model and actually working with external companies, bringing in new services or bringing in new technology. This was something that I wasn't expecting to happen to that extent. Right. And that's also quite encouraging when we launch other programs that are looking for partners in other regions, where we talk to them saying, it's not fantasy anymore, these things are happening, right? That's encouraging. That's encouraging because it's quite easy to get cynical about our industry. It's easy to get a little bit complacent, but also a little bit pessimistic about the industry. But seeing that there's some people out there who actually really want to do something different and manage to push this through the rather monolithic, slow-moving animals at other banks, that's exciting.
Well, that's a very interesting note to end on from a number of perspectives. For me, I go to places and you see these banners sponsored by X, Y, and Z or funded by X, Y, and Z, and it's just like kind of a logo. And as somebody turning up to events and things like that, you've got no real idea what's behind the logo appearing. I didn't realise that the depth that you say and how much involvement there is in practice and how much interest. It's not just they wrote you a check, oh yeah, thank you very much, look, make this guy go away, give him a check, we can say we're doing something. No, it really is actually changing them. And I think the other thing that I find that's really interesting, and it really applies to the interesting people, the interesting businesses in fintech, is this element of surprise that, you know, people with a lot of experience go, do you know what really surprised me? And that puts the light in your eyes. You know, there isn't a video camera here. There should be. But despite all your jet lag and that, there's genuine light in your eyes and enthusiasm. And stuff is happening. The word innovation gets misused in so many ways. But quite often it doesn't get used in dimensions. You know, you don't have to have an innovative product. You can have innovation in how the world works, which is what you're talking about, how things interact. And that's just as exciting at a meta level. Well, thank you very much for that, Nektarios. Time has flown by. And I'm really interested to hear about how you guys are expanding around the globe and your future plans. And I think that for all the startups listening now, and as you say, even more mature startups. I think this is a really interesting program to check out, you guys, and there's a small handful of other people who are genuine accelerators out there, with the emphasis of the word on genuine. So if you're looking as a startup for a program, make sure you find out what's in the program, because some are thinner than others, and you've been very modest in not banging the drum about you guys, but you're genuinely doing a fantastic job, and I look forward to seeing what your 1% shareholdings will be worth in 10 years' time, and whether I'm bringing you back on the show and you're flying me down to your yacht in the Mediterranean. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on iTunes or your podcast app, or sign up at londonfintechpodcast.com for email alerts of new episodes. Live long and prosper.
We could sit in a bend there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moon ride, watching a happy moon ride. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. The city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight dance.